In Phoenix's most exclusive combat facility, an elderly janitor was about to face public humiliation. What began as routine cleaning turned deadly serious when an arrogant boxing champion decided to make entertainment from cruelty. Elias Takoda wasn't your typical custodian. For 26 years he was Master Sergeant of U.S. Special Forces, known for training elite military units in advanced close-quarters combat and traditional martial arts. When Rico prime-cut Santoro demanded, the old man put on gloves for the crowd's amusement. He had no idea he was walking into the presence of a true master. Elias absorbed the mockery with centered stillness that would trigger a phone call to an old student. What began as a champion's cruel spectacle would become a profound reckoning. The Ironforge Combat Club would never be the same after Steven Seagal arrived to deliver the lesson Rico desperately needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A brutal punch echoed across the Ironforge Combat Club, sending the sparring partner crashing to the mat with a sickening thud. The crowd gasped as the referee dove in, checking if the man could even move, but the winner was already parading. Around, arms raised high, grin stretched wide across his cocky face. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why they call me Prime Cut," Rico Santoro shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls of Phoenix's most exclusive combat facility. Cameras flashed like lightning as live-stream comment sections exploded with fire emojis and wild predictions about his next title defense. The Ironforge Combat Club had transformed from a training facility into a spectacle for the afternoon. Red velvet ropes separated ordinary spectators from VIPs, influencers lounged in reserved sections, and production crews captured every angle of the undefeated champion's exhibition. Promotional banners bearing Rico's face and slogan, "Prime Cut," sharp and deadly, hung from every wall. Trevor Blackstone, the gym's owner, beamed from the corner, his investment in the young champion having paid off beyond his wildest dreams. The academy, once struggling to keep its doors open, now had a 6-month waiting list and celebrity clientele. Trevor adjusted his designer suit and nodded to the production team to keep the cameras rolling. "Tell me that wasn't worth the price of admission," Trevor bellowed into the microphone, playing to the crowd. The undisputed, undefeated, unstoppable prime-cut Santoro. In the commentary booth overlooking the gym floor, Miranda Cho adjusted her headset and kept her voice professional. "Santoro makes quick work of yet another sparring partner, his third today. His speed is undeniable, but I'm noticing the same pattern in these exhibitions. He's showcasing power, but leaving himself open on the left side, against a more disciplined opponent." She paused, watching Rico blow kisses to female fans in the front row. "Well, that remains to be seen." Her producer motioned for her to keep it positive. Miranda sighed and nodded. "Back to you, Trevor, for more with the champion." Rico grabbed a towel from his corner man but barely used it. He wasn't even breathing hard. The exhibition had lasted less than 2 rounds, exactly as planned. Everything about Rico Prime Cut Santoro was calculated for maximum exposure. His flame-red embroidered shorts, the theatrical way he entered the ring, even the precise number of seconds he'd wait before answering questions, just long enough to seem thoughtful without losing anyone's attention. "Prime Cut, you're 3 weeks out from defending your title. Any concerns about Martinez's reach advantage?" Trevor asked, playing the role of interviewer now. Rico laughed, running a gloved hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Martinez, man, dude's already cut up, he just doesn't know it yet." He turned to face a camera directly. "When you step in with Prime Cut, you get sliced and diced. That's just science, baby." The crowd ate it up, particularly the younger fans who mimicked his signature cutting gesture across their throats. Security guards kept the more enthusiastic spectators from rushing the ring as Rico continued his performance. While all eyes locked on the champion, an elderly man in gray coveralls quietly moved around the outer edge of the room. Elias Takoda kept his head down, methodically cleaning up discarded programs and water bottles. His movements were efficient, practiced. The hands that gripped the broom handle moved with surprising precision for a man his age. The janitor's badge on his chest read simply, "E. Takoda." When a rolled-up towel landed near his feet, tossed carelessly by one of Rico's entourage, Elias bent slowly to retrieve it. His joints protested, but his face betrayed no discomfort. His weathered hands, covered with old scars and calluses that spoke of a different kind of life, carefully placed the towel in his cleaning cart. Miranda noticed him from her booth. Something about the way he moved caught her attention. The economy of motion, the perfect balance. She'd seen that kind of movement before, but not from janitors. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him work. What about your training, Prime Cut? Any new techniques you're bringing to the championship? Trevor continued his softball. Questions. Man, I'm already perfect, Rico laughed. But sure, we mix it up. Keep adding tools to the arsenal. He shadowboxed a quick combination that drew cheers. The real question is whether these other fighters are even watching. They send these old men against me thinking experience beats raw talent. His eyes drifted across the gym floor and landed on Elias, who was now methodically mopping around the edge of the training area. Something sparked in Rico's expression, an opportunity for more entertainment. Speaking of old men, he said, voice rising to ensure the whole room heard him, check out Grandpa over there still pushing a mop when he should be in a retirement home. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the crowd. Some fans looked away, embarrassed, while others leaned forward, phones raised, eager for whatever might happen next. Trevor's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't intervene. Hey, Pops, Rico called out, waving Elias over. Come here for a second. Elias paused, then set his mop against the wall. He walked toward the ring with unhurried steps, his face expressionless. Up close, the contrast was striking. Rico, in his prime at 28, muscles gleaming with oil and youth. Elias, perhaps in his 70s, hair white, frame lean but somehow solid. Folks, we got ourselves a real veteran here, Rico announced, his voice dripping with mock respect. Tell us, Pops, you ever been in a ring before? Or is mopping floors the extent of your athletic career? The crowd's laughter grew louder, more cruel. Phone cameras zoomed in on Elias's weathered face, searching for reaction, for humiliation. But Elias simply looked at Rico with calm, dark eyes that seemed to see through the spectacle entirely. I clean what needs cleaning, Elias said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. There was something in his tone, not defeat, not anger, but a kind of centered stillness that cut through the noise. Rico sensed he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. The old man's composure frustrated him, made him push harder. That's beautiful, really. But I'm thinking maybe it's time you tried something new. What do you say we get you some gloves? Show these people what an old-timer can do? The suggestion sent the crowd into a frenzy. Comments flooded the live stream. This is insane. Someone stop this. This is going too far. But just as many were encouraging it, hungry for content, for viral moments, for something to share. Elias looked around the room, at the cameras, at the expectant faces, at the young champion who thought humiliation was entertainment. In that moment, something passed across his features, quick as a shadow. Not fear, not anger, but perhaps sadness. Thank you for the offer, Elias said simply. But I have work to finish. He turned to walk away, but Rico wasn't done. Come on, Pops, don't leave us hanging. Just one round. I promise I'll go easy on you. The mockery in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't about sport or fun. This was about power, about putting someone in their place for the entertainment of others. And as Elias Takoda picked up his mop and continued his quiet work, something in the room shifted. The laughter became forced. The energy turned sour. Miranda. Jo found herself typing furiously on her phone, no longer covering the event but researching. Something about the old janitor nagged at her. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, the complete absence of fear in his eyes when faced with public humiliation. In the back of the gym, a young woman in a wrestling coach's jacket watched the entire exchange with growing tension. Lena Takoda gripped her gym bag tighter, her jaw set with barely contained fury. She recognized that look in her grandfather's eyes, the same look he'd worn when he'd told her stories about the old days, about lessons that had to be taught, about respect that had to be earned. As Rico continued his exhibition, Basking in the crowd's renewed attention, Elias quietly finished mopping the floor. But those who were paying attention noticed something else. As he worked, he pulled out an old flip phone and sent a single text message. "It's happening again," he typed. "Ironforge Combat Club. Phoenix. Can you come?" 1,000 miles away, in a quiet house surrounded by mountains, Steven Seagal read the message and reached for his car keys. The aftermath of Rico's exhibition lingered in the air like smoke from a spent firework. While the champion continued to bask in the adulation of his fans, signing autographs and posing for selfies, the uncomfortable energy from his interaction with Elias had settled into the corners of the gym like dust that wouldn't sweep away. Miranda Cho couldn't shake what she'd witnessed. From her booth, she watched Elias methodically finish his cleaning routine, his movements unchanged by what had just transpired. There was something about his composure that bothered her, not because it was unusual for someone to maintain dignity in the face of mockery, but because his particular brand of calm seemed practiced, professional. "Hey, Jimmy," she called to her camera operator, "can you get me some background footage of the cleaning crew? I want to do a piece on the unsung heroes who keep these places running." Jimmy raised an eyebrow but complied, panning his camera toward Elias. As he did, Miranda opened her laptop and began typing in search terms. Elias Takoda, Takoda Phoenix, martial arts instructor Arizona. Her journalist instincts were humming. There was a story here beyond the surface spectacle. Meanwhile, Rico had moved to the center of the gym floor, still riding high on adrenaline and attention. Trevor appeared beside him, whispering something in his ear. Rico's grin widened. "Before we wrap up today's exhibition," Rico announced, his voice carrying over the crowd noise, "I think we owe our friend over there another chance to show us what he's got." He pointed at Elias, who was now emptying trash bins near the exit. "Come on, Pops. The people want to see you in action." This time, the crowd's response was more mixed. While some cheered and filmed eagerly, others shifted uncomfortably. A few voices called out for Rico to leave the old man alone, but they were drowned out by those hungry for content. Rico jogged over to his equipment bag and pulled out a pair of worn training gloves. He held them up theatrically. "What do you say, old-timer, just for fun? Light sparring. I'll barely touch you, promise." The cruelty was more obvious now, the pretense of good-natured fun wearing thin. Rico was essentially demanding that an elderly janitor humiliate himself for the entertainment of the crowd. The power dynamic was stark. The young, fit champion in his element, pressuring an older working man who had no real choice but to comply or face further mockery. Elias set down his trash bag and turned to face Rico. For a moment, the gym fell, quiet, everyone waiting to see how this would play out. When Elias spoke, his voice was steady, carrying clearly despite its softness. "Young man," he said, "I appreciate the gesture, but I think you'd be disappointed. I'm not much for putting on shows." "Come on," Rico pressed, tossing the gloves at Elias's feet. "Don't be shy. Everyone starts somewhere, right? I'll teach you a few basics. Think of it as a free lesson from a champion." The gloves landed with a soft thud near Elias's work boots. He looked down at them, then back at Rico. Something flickered in his dark eyes. Not anger, but perhaps a kind of weary recognition. He'd seen this before, this particular brand of young arrogance that mistook cruelty for confidence. "I thank you for the offer," Elias said again, making no move to pick up the gloves. "But as I said, I have work to finish." Rico's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to being refused, especially not in front of cameras. His public persona demanded that he be the center of attention, the one in control. An old janitor ignoring his generous offer made him look foolish. "Come on, everyone," Rico called to the crowd, playing up his frustration. "Tell Pops here that he should give it a try. What's the worst that could happen?" A chorus of voices joined in, some genuinely encouraging, others clearly enjoying the spectacle of potential humiliation. The pressure in the room was palpable, all focused on one elderly man who just wanted to finish his shift and go home. In her booth, Miranda had found what she was looking for. Her laptop screen showed a decades-old photograph from the Arizona Republic's archives. A much younger Elias Takoda in military dress uniform, standing with a group of Special Forces trainees. The caption read, Master Sergeant E. Takoda leads advanced combat training at Fort Huachuca. Takoda, a specialist in close-quarters combat and traditional martial arts, has trained some of the military's most elite units. Her breath caught. She screenshot the image and kept digging. More photos emerged, Elias teaching at various dojos, posed with students who went on to become professional fighters, receiving commendations for his service. This wasn't just any janitor. This was a man with a history that Rico couldn't possibly comprehend. Back on the gym floor, Lena Takoda had moved closer, her face tight with controlled anger. She'd watched enough. Just as she started to step forward, ready to put an end to this humiliation, Elias caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Wait, his expression said. Not yet. I tell you what, Rico said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. If you won't put on the gloves, at least show us some of those martial arts moves old guys like you are always bragging about. You know, all that ancient wisdom stuff. Karate chop, some boards or something. He was miming exaggerated martial arts poses now, drawing laughter from his supporters. The mockery was complete. He'd reduced an entire culture and tradition to cartoonish stereotypes. Elias watched the display without expression. When Rico finished his performance, Elias simply said, I think you have me confused with someone else. But those who were really watching, Miranda from her booth, Lena from the crowd, even some of the more observant gym members, noticed something else. As Rico had been performing his mocking routine, Elias had shifted his stance slightly. His feet had found perfect balance, his hands had settled into a position that looked casual, but was actually precisely placed for immediate response. His breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more centered. For just a moment, the janitor's mask had slipped, revealing something underneath that was far more substantial than Rico could possibly realize. Well, this has been fun, Elias said finally, but I really do need to finish my work. He bent to retrieve his cleaning supplies, and as he did, he quietly picked up the discarded boxing gloves and placed them neatly on a nearby bench. Perhaps another time. He walked toward the exit with the same unhurried pace he'd maintained all day, but as he passed near where Lena stood, he paused just long enough to murmur, Tell your mother I'll be home for dinner, and tell her it might be time. Lena's eyes widened slightly. She nodded, understanding passing between them that went deeper than words. Rico, frustrated by his inability to provoke a reaction, called after him. That's right. Pops, run along! Maybe stick to floors, they don't hit back! The laughter that followed felt forced, hollow. Even some of Rico's most devoted fans seemed uncomfortable with how far this had gone. The energy in the room had shifted from excitement to something uglier, and everyone could feel it. As Elias pushed through the exit doors, he pulled out his phone again. This time he made a call. Steven, he said when the phone was answered. Yes, it's me, I know it's been a while. He paused, listening. No, I'm calling because it's happening again. The same thing we talked about years ago. The disrespect, the showboating, the cruelty dressed up as entertainment. Another pause. Phoenix, Ironforge Combat Club, Rico Santoro. He listened again, and for the first time that day, something like a smile crossed his weathered features. Yes, he said quietly. I think it's time for a lesson. Inside the gym, Miranda was furiously researching, uncovering layer after layer of Elias's incredible background. Trevor was already planning how to spin the day's events into more promotional material. Rico was holding court with reporters, completely unaware that he'd just humiliated a man who had trained some of the most dangerous fighters in the world. And somewhere in the mountains outside Los Angeles, Steven Seagal was packing a simple gym bag, his face set in an expression of quiet determination. The lesson was about to begin. In a quiet house nestled among the rolling hills outside Los Angeles, Steven Seagal set down his phone and stared out the window at the ancient oak trees that surrounded his property. The call from Elias had transported him back 30 years, to a small dojo in Tucson, where a young, angry version of himself had learned the hardest lessons of his life. He walked to his study, where photographs and memories from decades of training lined the walls. His fingers found one particular frame, a black and white photo of himself and Elias from 1989. Steven was in his early 40s then, already making movies, already famous, but still carrying himself with the rigid aggression of someone who confused strength with dominance. In the photo, Elias looked much as he did now, calm, centered, wearing the expression of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. The difference was in Steven's face, tight with frustration, jaw clenched, eyes burning with the kind of anger that came from having your worldview shattered by quiet wisdom. He remembered that day clearly. He'd come to Elias's dojo in Phoenix, after hearing rumors about an old Native American master who could break fighters without touching them. Steven had been at the height of his physical prowess then, convinced that his size and speed made him invulnerable. He'd challenged Elias to demonstrate his supposed abilities. What happened next had changed everything. Steven pulled the photo from its frame and turned it over. In Elias's careful handwriting were the words, "True power serves, false power dominates. Remember this when the time comes to choose." That time, Steven realized, had come. He moved through his house with deliberate purpose, gathering what he needed: a simple black GI, worn soft from years of training, a leather gym bag that had traveled with him around the world, and from a locked drawer in his desk a small piece of turquoise on a leather cord, a gift from Elias after their first real lesson together. As he packed, memories flooded back. The day Elias had shown him that all his movie fight scenes were just choreographed dance compared to real combat. The afternoon when the old master had put him on his back 17 times in a row without Steven ever seeing the techniques coming. The evening when Elias had finally explained that the martial arts weren't about winning fights, they were about avoiding them. The warrior's greatest victory, Elias had said, is the battle that never needs to be fought. Steven had struggled with that concept for years. His career was built on the opposite philosophy, on being the strongest, the fastest, the most dangerous man in the room. But slowly, under Elias's patient guidance, he'd begun to understand the difference between being powerful and being in power of oneself. Now, driving through the Arizona desert as the sun began to set, Steven found himself entering the same meditative state he'd learned from his old teacher. His breathing deepened. His mind cleared of everything except the present moment. This wasn't about revenge or dominance, this was about teaching, just as Elias had taught him. Back at the Ironforge Combat Club, Rico was living his best life. The footage from his exhibition had already gone viral, with clips of him mocking Elias racking up millions of views across social media platforms. The comments were divided, some praising his savage humor and others condemning his cruelty, but all generating the engagement that fueled his brand. "Bro, you absolutely destroyed that old dude," laughed Marcus, one of Rico's training partners, as they reviewed the footage on their phones. "The way he just stood there taking it, priceless." Trevor Blackstone was equally pleased. The controversy was driving traffic to his gym's social media accounts at unprecedented rates. Membership inquiries were pouring in, and 3 different streaming services had reached out about documenting Rico's title defense. As far as Trevor was concerned, humiliating an elderly janitor was the best marketing move they'd made all year. "We need to capitalize on this momentum," Trevor told Rico as they sat in his office planning their next move. "Maybe we can get the old guy back, set up some kind of formal challenge, really milk this thing." Rico nodded enthusiastically, already envisioning the content possibilities. But even as he planned his next publicity stunt, something nagged at him about the encounter with Elias. The old man's composure had been unsettling. Most people, when confronted with public humiliation, either fought back or broke down. Elias had done neither. He'd simply absorbed it all with a kind of centered stillness that Rico couldn't quite understand. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, Miranda Cho was putting together the biggest story of her career. Her research into Elias Takoda had revealed an extraordinary history. 26 years in the Army, including tours with special forces in Central America and the Middle East, advanced training in multiple martial arts disciplines, commendations for developing hand-to-hand combat curricula that were still being used by elite military units. But more intriguingly, she'd found records of Elias teaching private lessons to a select group of Hollywood actors in the late 1980s and early 1990s, including a young Steven Seagal. She was still processing this information when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Cho, this is Lena Takoda. We need to talk. It's about my grandfather." They met at a coffee shop a few blocks from the gym. Lena was younger than Miranda had expected, mid-20s with her grandfather's dark eyes and composed manner, but carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone used to being in charge. "You've been researching my grandfather," Lena said without preamble. "I have," Miranda admitted. "His background is impressive. Why didn't he defend himself today? With his training, he could have made Rico look foolish without even trying." Lena stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Because that's not who he is anymore. Grandpa served his country, trained fighters, lived in that world for decades, but he walked away from it after." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "After he lost a student, someone he'd trained who died in competition because Grandpa had made him too confident, too eager to prove himself. So he became a janitor? He became a guardian," Lena corrected. "He works at gyms and dojos watching, making sure the young fighters don't lose themselves to ego and aggression the way his student did. He's saved more careers and probably more lives than anyone knows, just by being present, by modeling humility." Miranda was beginning to understand. "And today? Today someone crossed a line. Grandpa spent years avoiding confrontation, choosing peace over pride, but what that Rico kid did..." Lena's jaw tightened. "That wasn't just disrespecting an old man. That was disrespecting everything Grandpa represents, everything he's tried to teach. So what happens now?" Lena checked her phone. Grandpa made a call to an old student of his, someone who learned the same lessons Grandpa teaches but in a very different way. She showed Miranda a news alert on her phone. "Steven Seagal, spotted in Phoenix, mysterious visit to local gym." Miranda's eyes widened. The pieces were falling into place. Back at the gym, Rico was wrapping up his evening training session when the front doors opened. The conversation in the gym gradually died as people turned to see who had entered. Steven Seagal walked in quietly, wearing simple black clothing and moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. The reaction was immediate but muted. Unlike Rico's flashy entrances, Steven's presence filled the room without announcement or fanfare. He simply walked to where Elias was quietly arranging equipment for the next day's classes. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, decades of shared history passing between them in silence. Then Steven placed his hand briefly on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement that everyone in the gym could feel, even if they didn't understand it. "Teacher," Steven said quietly. "Student," Elias replied with the faintest smile. Rico, who had been mid-conversation with a group of fans, fell silent. Something about the dynamic between the two older men demanded attention. The room had taken on a different energy, quieter, more focused, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing something significant. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Trevor Blackstone, ever the opportunist, approached with his phone already recording. "Steven Seagal, what brings you to Ironforge? Are you here to train? Maybe we could set up an exhibition with..." Steven's gaze shifted to Trevor, and the gym owner's words died in his throat. There was no hostility in Steven's expression, no threat, just a kind of centered authority that made further conversation impossible. "I'm here," Steven said simply, "to observe." He found a quiet corner where he could see the entire gym floor and settled into a position that looked casual, but was perfectly balanced for instant movement. His eyes found Rico, who was trying to appear nonchalant but clearly struggling, with the unexpected presence of a legitimate legend. The evening's activities continued, but everything felt different now. Where before there had been loud music and flashy demonstrations, now there was a kind of hushed intensity. Fighters trained. With more focus, conversations were quieter, and everyone kept glancing toward the corner where Steven sat in patient stillness. Rico tried to continue his usual routine, throwing powerful combinations, trash-talking with his sparring partners, playing to his phone cameras. But he could feel Steven's gaze on him, measuring, evaluating. It was deeply unsettling. Finally, unable to ignore the presence any longer, Rico approached Steven's corner. "Hey man, I don't know if you saw my exhibition earlier, but I'm Rico Santoro, prime cut, undefeated champion." He extended his hand with his trademark cocky grin. Steven looked at the offered hand for a moment, then back at Rico's face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly. "I heard about what happened earlier," he said. Rico's grin faltered slightly. "Oh, that? That was nothing, just having some fun with the old-timer, no harm done." "No harm," Steven repeated, his tone neutral. "Right. Just a little entertainment for the crowd. The old guy was cool with it." Steven stood up slowly, his movement fluid and controlled. He was slightly shorter than Rico, but seemed to occupy more space, his presence expanding to fill the area around them. "Would you like to train?" Steven asked. Rico's eyes lit up. This was what he'd been hoping for. A chance to spar with a legend, to add another viral moment to his collection. "Absolutely. Light sparring? I promise I'll take it easy on you, old school." Steven nodded once. "Light contact, 1 round, and Rico?" "Yeah." No talking. As word spread that Rico Santoro was about to spar with Steven Seagal, the gym filled with an electric anticipation. Phones appeared, cameras were positioned, and even Miranda Cho arrived, having been tipped off by Lena. But as the two men prepared to step onto the mat, the atmosphere was unlike any of Rico's previous exhibitions. There was no music, no announcements, no theatrics. Just two fighters, one young and eager to prove himself, the other calm and centered, preparing to deliver a lesson that had been 30 years in the making. In the corner, Elias Takoda watched with the patience of someone who had seen this story play out before, who knew how it ended, and who understood that sometimes the most important lessons came not from words, but from the quiet demonstration of what true mastery looked like. The lesson was about to begin. The Ironforge Combat Club had never been quieter. As word spread through text messages and social media that Steven Seagal had arrived and was about to spar with Rico Santoro, the gym filled with a different kind of crowd than the usual exhibition attracted. Serious fighters paused their training to watch. Even the most jaded veterans sensed they were about to witness something significant. Miranda Cho positioned herself with a clear view of the mat, her camera operator beside her. This wasn't content for entertainment. This felt like documentation of something historic. She noticed Lena Takoda standing near the wall, her grandfather's calm expression reflected in her own face as she watched the scene unfold. Rico bounced on his toes as he pulled on his gloves, his usual pre-fight energy amplified by nervous excitement. He'd sparred with former champions before, but never with someone of Steven Seagal's reputation. The opportunity to add this footage to his highlight reel was enormous, assuming he performed well. "Yo, chat," he called to his phone propped up nearby, live streaming to his social media followers. "About to school a legend. Make sure you're recording this." In stark contrast, Steven Seagal prepared in silence. He'd changed into a simple, black G, moving through basic stretches with the fluid precision of someone whose body was a perfectly tuned instrument. His preparation was meditative, purposeful, each movement deliberate and centered. Trevor Blackstone worked the crowd, his promoter instincts in overdrive. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness something special. Two masters of their respective arts representing different generations of combat sports." But Steven's presence seemed to dampen Trevor's usual carnival barker energy. There was something about the older man's quiet authority that made loud promotion feel inappropriate, almost disrespectful. Ground rules, Steven said as he stepped onto the mat, his voice carrying despite its softness. Light contact, no trash talk. We stop when I say stop. Rico nodded eagerly, though something in Steven's tone made him slightly uneasy. Sounds good, old school. Let's do this. They touched gloves, and immediately the difference between them became apparent. Rico was coiled tension, muscles tight, breathing quick, eyes darting as he sized up his opponent. Steven was still water, perfectly balanced, breathing deep and slow, his gaze focused but relaxed. The sparring began. Rico opened with his signature combination, a sharp jab followed by a power hook, the same sequence that had dropped his sparring partner earlier. It was fast, technically sound, and designed to make an immediate impression. Steven wasn't there. Not in a dramatic, theatrical way. He hadn't leaped or rolled or performed any flashy evasion. He had simply shifted his weight slightly, angled, his body just enough that Rico's punches found only air. The movement was so subtle that many in the crowd missed it entirely. Rico reset, throwing another combination. Again, Steven seemed to melt away from the strikes without visible effort. It was as if he existed slightly outside the space Rico was attacking, always just beyond reach but never appearing to retreat. Frustration began to creep into Rico's technique. He increased his pace, throwing more punches with greater force. The crowd watched as the young champion unleashed combination after combination, each one missing by the narrowest of margins. Steven never retreated, never backed up, never seemed hurried or defensive. He simply existed in the spaces between, Rico's attacks like water flowing around stones. What the hell? Rico muttered, breathing harder now. His usual sparring partners would have been hurt or at least pressured by this volume of offense. Steven looked like he was practicing Tai Chi in a gentle breeze. Miranda found herself leaning forward, fascinated. She'd covered dozens of fights, but she'd never seen anything like this. Steven wasn't fighting, he was demonstrating. Every non-response to Rico's attacks was a lesson in efficiency, in understanding distance and timing, and the fundamental principles that governed all combat. Rico tried a different approach, attempting to cut off the ring, to trap Steven against the ropes. But somehow Steven was always exactly where he chose to be, never where Rico expected him. It wasn't speed, it was something deeper, anticipation. Understanding. The young champion was beginning to breathe hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Steven's breathing remained deep and controlled, his expression calm and almost compassionate. Stand still and fight, Rico snapped, his frustration boiling over. Steven paused, holding up one hand. What did I say about talking? The gentleness in his voice somehow made the correction more devastating than any shout could have been. Rico fell silent, chastened despite himself. They resumed, and now Steven began to add small elements to his evasions. As Rico threw a wild hook, Steven didn't just avoid it. He guided it past him with the lightest touch, using Rico's own momentum to pull him slightly off balance. When Rico recovered and threw an uppercut, Steven redirected it upward with an open palm, again using the attacker's force against him. The crowd was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a fight. It was a masterclass in the fundamental principles of martial arts. Steven was demonstrating concepts that went beyond any single fighting style. Redirection over opposition, efficiency over force, centered calm over frantic energy. Rico's technique began to deteriorate as fatigue and frustration mounted. His punches became wilder, his footwork sloppy. He was chasing something he couldn't catch, fighting an opponent who seemed to exist in a different dimension of combat entirely. Then Steven began to counter. Not with punches or kicks, but with the gentlest touches that had profound effects. As Rico threw, the transformation in the sparring match was subtle at first, like watching a master painter add the finest details to a canvas. Steven Seagal began to move with Rico rather than simply around him, his responses becoming more interactive, more instructive. When Rico threw his next combination, a jab cross-hook sequence that had served him well in professional bouts, Steven didn't just evade. He intercepted the jab with an open palm, redirecting it gently downward, while simultaneously stepping. into Rico's space. The cross never came because Rico found himself suddenly too close to throw it effectively, and the hook became an awkward, off-balance swing that Steven guided harmlessly past his head. "What the—" Rico started, then caught himself remembering Steven's instruction about silence. The crowd was transfixed. Miranda Cho found herself holding her breath as she watched Steven demonstrate principles she'd read about but never seen applied so clearly. This was Aikido in its purest form, not the flowery demonstrations often seen in movies, but the practical, devastatingly effective art of using an opponent's aggression against them. Rico reset again, his breathing becoming labored. Sweat dripped from his chin onto the mat. In contrast, Steven appeared completely relaxed, his movements fluid and economical. His breathing remained deep and controlled, as if he were meditating rather than sparring. Growing desperate to land something, anything, Rico attempted his most powerful technique, a looping overhand right that had knocked out 3 of his last 5 opponents. He put everything behind it, his whole body committed to the strike. Steven simply wasn't there when it arrived. But more than that, as Rico's momentum carried him forward, Steven placed one hand lightly on his back and another on his extended arm. The touch was gentle, barely perceptible, but it had the effect of accelerating Rico's forward motion just slightly. The young champion stumbled past Steven, nearly losing his balance entirely. A murmur ran through the crowd. They were beginning to understand that they weren't watching a contest. They were watching a demonstration of mastery so complete that the master never needed to hurt his student to prove his superiority. Rico spun around, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You're not even fighting," he protested, forgetting about silence again. Steven stopped and looked at him with genuine curiosity. "What do you think fighting is?" The question hung in the air. Rico opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. What did he think fighting was? Landing the hardest shots? Dominating an opponent? Proving who was stronger, faster, tougher? "Fighting," Steven said quietly, "is what happens when communication breaks down. When ego overrides wisdom. When we forget that our opponent is also our teacher." He gestured for Rico to continue. "Try again, but this time listen with your body, not just your fists." Rico attempted to process this advice, but his frustration was mounting. Nothing in his training had prepared him for an opponent who seemed to exist in a different paradigm entirely. Every technique he'd mastered, every strategy he'd developed, seemed irrelevant against Steven's fluid responses. He threw another combination, this one more measured, trying to feel his way through Steven's defenses. But again, Steven's responses were subtle redirections that left Rico hitting air and finding himself slightly off balance each time. As the round continued, something strange began to happen. Rico's movements, despite his growing fatigue, started to become more controlled. Unconsciously, he was beginning to mirror some of Steven's economy of motion. His breathing, though still labored, was deeper. His attacks, while still unsuccessful, were more thoughtful. Steven noticed the change immediately. This was what made him a true teacher, the ability to see growth even in failure, potential even in frustration. But Rico's ego wasn't ready for such subtle lessons. As Steven guided away another punch with that same gentle redirection, Rico snapped. All his frustration, all his embarrassment at being made to look foolish in front of his fans and cameras, boiled over into pure aggression. With a roar of anger, he abandoned all technique and threw a wild haymaker with every ounce of strength he possessed. This wasn't sparring anymore. This was him trying to hurt Steven Seagal, to prove that raw power could overcome whatever philosophical nonsense the older man was demonstrating. The punch was telegraphed, crude, and loaded with malicious intent. For the first time in the sparring session, Steven's expression changed. The compassionate patience was replaced by something harder, more focused. As Rico's fist hurtled toward his head, Steven Seagal moved with decisive action for the first time in the match. Time seemed to slow as Steven responded to Rico's rage-fueled attack. The wild haymaker that had been thrown with intent to injure met not evasion or redirection, but a precise economical counter that demonstrated the difference between aggression and controlled force. Steven stepped inside Rico's punch, his movement so fluid it seemed like he was dancing. His left hand rose to meet Rico's incoming fist, not to block it but to guide it slightly upward and past his head. Simultaneously, his right hand, moving, with a deceptive gentleness, placed itself against Rico's solar plexus. What happened next was not a strike in any conventional sense. Steven didn't punch or push. Instead, he applied a precise focused pressure, a technique that combined the principles of acupressure with the timing of perfect leverage. It was the kind of touch that required decades of study to understand, let alone execute. Rico's forward momentum suddenly stopped as if he'd run into an invisible wall. His eyes widened in shock as every muscle in his core seemed to seize simultaneously. The breath left his lungs in a sharp gasp, and his legs, which had been carrying him forward with such aggressive intent, buckled beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, not from pain but from a complete disruption of his body's coordination. His diaphragm spasmed, making it impossible to draw breath. His hands went to his chest, his face a mask of confusion and panic as he struggled to understand what had just happened to him. The gym fell completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of training equipment and ventilation systems seemed muted, as everyone processed what they'd witnessed. It had happened so quickly, so quietly, that many spectators weren't sure what they'd seen. Miranda's camera operator had caught it all, the footage showing Steven's movement in perfect detail, the subtle step, the guiding hand, the gentle placement of pressure, and Rico's sudden collapse. It was like watching someone turn off a light switch on human consciousness. Steven immediately knelt beside Rico, his demeanor shifting from focused warrior back to compassionate teacher. "Breathe," he said softly, placing one hand on Rico's back. "Slow, deep breaths. You're not hurt." Rico tried to speak but could only gasp. His body was betraying him in a way he'd never experienced. He was conscious, aware, but completely unable to function normally. It was terrifying and humbling in equal measure. "This is what happens," Steven continued, his voice gentle but clear enough for the entire gym to hear, "when we let anger drive our actions. Your body forgot how to work with itself. You became your own opponent." With careful movements, Steven helped Rico sit back against the ropes. His hands moved to specific points on Rico's back and chest, applying gentle pressure that gradually restored normal breathing and muscle coordination. Within minutes, Rico was breathing normally again, though his face remained flushed with embarrassment and something deeper, the recognition that he'd encountered something completely beyond his understanding. "How?" Rico whispered, his voice hoarse. "Pressure points," Steven explained simply. "But more than that, timing, understanding, and 30 years of learning when not to fight." He helped Rico to his feet, supporting him until his legs were steady. "You're not hurt because I didn't want to hurt you. I wanted to teach you." The crowd remained frozen, unsure how to react. This hadn't been a knockout or a submission. It had been something more profound. A demonstration that true martial arts mastery wasn't about domination, but about control so complete that violence became unnecessary. Trevor Blackstone, ever the promoter, started to approach with his camera, ready to spin this into content. But one look from Steven stopped him cold. There would be no exploitation of this moment, no viral clips or promotional material. What had just happened was sacred in its own way, a teaching moment that deserved respect, not commodification. Rico sat on a training bench, his head in his hands, struggling to process what he'd experienced. His entire worldview had been challenged, not through argument or philosophy, but through direct, undeniable physical demonstration. Everything he thought he knew about fighting, about strength, about what it meant to be powerful, had been quietly dismantled by an older man who had barely raised his voice. Elias Takoda approached slowly, carrying a towel and a bottle of water. He sat beside Rico without speaking, offering both items with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout his humiliation earlier that day. "I don't understand," Rico said finally, accepting the water. "I've never. No one's ever." "It made you feel powerless?" Elias asked gently. Rico nodded, unable to meet the older man's eyes. That's because you've been fighting people who were trying to beat you, Elias continued. Steven wasn't trying to beat you, he was trying to teach you. There's a difference. Steven joined them, settling easily into a cross-legged position on the mat. Your technique is strong, he told Rico. Your conditioning is excellent. Your heart is. He paused, considering. Your heart is confused. You've learned to use fighting as a way to prove your worth, to dominate others, to feed your ego. But fighting can be something else entirely. Rico looked up, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. What else can it be? A conversation, Steven said simply. A way of understanding yourself and others. A path to discovering what you're really capable of when you stop trying to prove how tough you are and start learning how aware you can become. Miranda watched this exchange with growing amazement. The young champion who had entered the ring 30 minutes ago, cocky, cruel, desperate for attention, was gone. In his place sat someone who had been fundamentally changed by the experience of encountering true mastery. As the crowd began to disperse, many fighters approaching Steven with respectful requests to learn from him, Rico remained seated, processing the most important defeat of his life. For the first time since he'd started boxing, he wasn't thinking about his next victory or his social media metrics or his brand. Instead, he was thinking about what it might mean to learn something real, something that couldn't be measured in knockouts or titles or viral moments. Something that had to do with the kind of man he wanted to become, rather than the image he wanted to project. The lesson was complete, but the real learning was just beginning. The Ironforge Combat Club emptied slowly after Steven's demonstration, fighters and spectators filing out in hushed conversations that carried a different quality than the usual post-event chatter. There was no bragging about technique or arguments about scoring. Instead, people spoke in the reverent tones reserved for having witnessed something genuinely profound. Rico Santoro sat alone in the fighter's lounge, a cramped room behind the main gym floor that smelled of liniment and old sweat. For the first time in years, he was completely by himself. No entourage, no cameras, no social media manager hovering with content ideas. The silence felt foreign and uncomfortable. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The footage of his encounter with Steven was already spreading across platforms, but Rico found himself unable to look at the screen. The comments, he knew, would be brutal. His carefully crafted image as an invincible champion had been dismantled in front of thousands of viewers by an older man who had barely raised his voice. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Miranda Cho stood in the doorway, her camera operator notably absent. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. "Off the record." Rico gestured to a folding chair, his usual swagger completely absent. "Come to get quotes about how it feels to be humiliated?" Miranda studied his face, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Without the performative arrogance, without the constant need to project invincibility, Rico appeared younger, more vulnerable. Almost like the scared kid he'd probably been before fame and success had hardened him into a caricature of himself. "Actually," she said, settling into the chair, "I wanted to ask how it feels to learn something." The question caught Rico off guard. He'd expected mockery, analysis of his failure, predictions about his career prospects. Instead, Miranda was looking at him with something that might have been compassion. "I don't know," he admitted finally. Nobody's ever made me feel like that before, like I was completely out of my depth." "What did it feel like?" Rico was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to describe an experience that defied his usual vocabulary of dominance and conquest. "Like I was a kid again," he said eventually. "Like I was playing at being tough instead of actually being strong." Miranda nodded. "I've been researching Elias Takoda, the janitor you humiliated earlier. Did you know he trained some of the most elite special forces units in the military? That he's forgotten more about combat than most professional fighters will ever learn?" Rico's stomach dropped. "I didn't. He was just a working man trying to do his job," Miranda finished. "A man with more real combat experience than probably everyone in this gym combined, who chose humility over ego, service over glory." The weight of his actions settled on Rico like a physical burden. He'd built his entire persona on the idea that he was tougher, stronger, more deserving of respect than others. But today had shown him men who possessed real strength, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, didn't need to humiliate others to feel powerful. "What do I do now?" he asked, the question coming out more vulnerable than he'd intended. Miranda leaned forward. "That depends. Do you want to keep being Prime Cut Santoro, the social media champion who picks on old men for content? Or do you want to find out who Rico actually is when he's not performing for cameras?" Before Rico could answer, Trevor Blackstone burst through the door, his phone pressed to his ear and his face animated with excitement. "Rico, there you are!" He ended his call and turned to them with the manic energy of a man who'd found a way to spin disaster into profit. "Okay, so the footage is going absolutely nuclear online. I've got 3 streaming services wanting to do a documentary, 2 fight promoters interested in setting up a rematch, and, get this, Steven Seagal's people reached out about doing a whole series of exhibitions." Rico stared at him in disbelief. "Trevor, did you see what just happened out there?" "I saw content gold, baby. This is the kind of controversy that builds legends. We just need to control the narrative, maybe. Get you some training with Steven, really milk the redemption angle." "Get out," Rico said quietly. Trevor stopped mid-sentence. "What?" "I said get out." Rico's voice was calm but carried an authority that hadn't been there before. "And take your cameras and your content ideas with you." Trevor's face went through several expressions: confusion, anger, calculation. "Rico, you're not thinking clearly. This is business. This is your career." "This is my life," Rico interrupted, "and I'm done letting you turn it into a circus." After a moment of tense silence, Trevor stormed out, muttering about contracts and obligations. Miranda watched the exchange with growing respect for Rico's newfound clarity. "That couldn't have been easy," she said. Rico managed a wan smile. "Easier than I thought it would be. Turns out when you stop caring about being the toughest guy in the room, you can focus on being the rightest guy in the room instead." Meanwhile, in the main gym, Elias Takoda approached her grandfather as he finished his evening cleaning routine. Elias worked with the same methodical precision he always did, showing no signs of being affected by the day's events. "How do you do it, Grandpa?" she asked. "How do you stay so calm when people treat you like that?" Elias paused in his sweeping, considering the question. "When I was young in the military, I thought strength meant never showing weakness, never backing down, never letting anyone disrespect you. I got into more fights than I can count, always, trying to prove I was the toughest man in the room." He resumed sweeping, his movements meditative and precise. "Then I learned that real strength is being able to absorb disrespect without becoming disrespectful yourself. Being able to face humiliation without losing your dignity. Being secure enough in who you are that you don't need others to acknowledge it." Lena watched him work, seeing not just her grandfather but the master teacher he'd always been, even when the world couldn't see it. "Steven learned that lesson the hard way too," Elias continued. "He was angry when he was young, always. Fighting to prove himself. It took years for him to understand that the strongest position is often the most humble one." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Steven appeared from the shadows of the gym. He'd changed back into street clothes but moved with the same centered grace he'd shown during the sparring session. "Teacher," he said, offering Elias a respectful bow. "Student," Elias replied with a slight smile. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for calling. I needed the reminder as much as he did." They stood together in comfortable silence. 2 men who understood that the most important victories were often invisible to everyone, except those who fought them. Around them, the gym settled into evening quiet, but somehow it felt different now. Less like a place of ego and spectacle, more like what it was meant to be. A place where people came to discover what they were truly capable of. 3 weeks. Later, Rico Santoro's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every morning since his encounter with Steven Seagal. But instead of checking his phone for overnight social media metrics or planning his next viral post, He simply rolled out of bed and pulled on worn training clothes. The Ironforge Combat Club was empty at this hour, exactly as Rico preferred it now. No cameras, no crowds, no distractions, just the honest work of discovering what his body could do when it wasn't performing for others. He'd negotiated with Trevor to train during off hours, away from the circus atmosphere that had once fueled his ego. His workout had changed completely. Gone were the flashy combinations designed to look impressive on video. Instead, Rico focused on fundamentals: footwork, breathing, balance. He spent an hour each morning practicing the Aikido basics Steven had recommended, moving through forms that emphasized redirection over force, flow over rigidity. The work was humbling. Techniques that looked simple when Steven demonstrated them proved maddeningly difficult to execute properly. Rico would spend 20 minutes trying to master a single movement, only to realize he was still missing some essential element of timing or positioning. From across the gym, Elias Takoda observed these morning sessions with quiet approval. The janitor had returned to his usual routine of arriving early to prepare the facility for the day's training, but Rico had begun to notice the precision in Elias's movements, the economy of motion that spoke of decades of disciplined practice. This morning, as Rico struggled with a particularly challenging redirection technique, Elias approached quietly. "Your stance is too wide," the older man said simply. "You're trying to generate power from your legs, but this technique comes from your center." Rico paused, looking at the man he'd publicly humiliated just weeks earlier. Shame and gratitude warred in his expression. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I did to you, for how I treated you." Elias nodded once, acknowledging the apology without making a show of forgiveness. "Show me the technique again." For the next 30 minutes, Elias guided Rico through the movement with patient correction. His teaching style was completely different from Steven's, where Steven had demonstrated through overwhelming mastery. Elias taught through subtle adjustment, gentle correction, allowing Rico to discover the proper form through his own experimentation. "Better," Elias said finally, as Rico executed the technique with something approaching competence. "But remember, this isn't about perfecting the movement. It's about understanding the principle behind it." "What principle?" "That you don't overcome force by applying greater force. You overcome it by understanding it, accepting it, and redirecting it toward a better purpose." Rico wiped sweat from his forehead, processing this wisdom. "Is that what you did with me? When I was being cruel?" "I absorbed your cruelty without becoming cruel myself," Elias replied. "I let your anger pass through me instead of meeting it with my own anger. That's the beginning of wisdom." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miranda Cho, who'd been documenting Rico's transformation for a very different kind of story than the sensational content that usually surrounded combat sports. "How's the training going?" she asked, setting up her camera discreetly. "Slowly," Rico admitted. "Turns out learning to fight properly is harder than learning to look like you can fight." Miranda had been following Rico's journey closely, watching him strip away the performative aspects of his previous training to focus on substance. Her documentary, tentatively titled The Lesson, was shaping up to be a profound examination of what happened when ego was removed from martial arts. The footage she'd captured over the past weeks told a remarkable story. Rico training alone at dawn, his movements becoming more controlled and purposeful. His social media presence evolving from braggadocious highlights to thoughtful reflections on discipline and respect. His relationship with fans shifting from entertainer audience to teacher-student. "The response to your transformation has been interesting," Miranda told him. "Some of your old fans are disappointed. They miss the trash talk and the spectacle, but you're gaining a different kind of following. People who are interested in authentic martial arts, in personal growth." Rico nodded. "I lost about half my followers in the first week. Turns out a lot of people were only interested in me when I was being an asshole." "How does that feel?" "Liberating," Rico said without hesitation. "I don't have to perform being tough anymore. I can just work on actually becoming strong." As if to underscore his point, Rico's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it briefly, then set it aside without responding, a small gesture that represented a massive shift in priorities. Miranda noticed the change. Old Rico would have checked that immediately. Old Rico was addicted to validation, Rico replied. New Rico is trying to find validation in the work itself. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other early morning training partners. Not the usual entourage of yes-men and social media managers, but serious martial artists who had been drawn to Rico's newfound commitment to authentic training. Among them was Danny Reyes, a veteran boxer who'd initially been skeptical of Rico's transformation, but had gradually become impressed by the young champion's dedication to learning rather than performing. "You ready for some real sparring today?" Danny asked, pulling on his gloves. Rico nodded, but his approach to sparring had changed dramatically. Where once he'd entered every session looking to dominate, to make highlight reel moments, now he treated sparring as collaborative learning. He focused on implementing the principles Elias and Steven had taught him, often allowing his partners to work through techniques rather than simply trying to shut them down. The session that followed was technical, methodical, and completely lacking in the theatrical elements that had once defined Rico's training. But for those who understood what they were watching, it was far more impressive than any of his previous exhibitions. Rico moved with increasing fluidity, his defensive work showing the influence of Aikido principles. Instead of meeting force with force, he began to demonstrate the redirection techniques he'd been practicing. His offense became more economical, less about overwhelming power and more about precise timing and positioning. Most importantly, his attitude toward his training partners had completely changed. Where he'd once seen sparring partners as props in his performance, obstacles to overcome for content creation, he now treated them as collaborators in mutual improvement. "That's enough for today," Rico called out after an hour of focused work. No showboating, no dramatic finish, just honest training that ended when it had served its purpose. As the group cooled down, Miranda conducted brief interviews for her documentary. The responses painted a picture of a man who had fundamentally changed his relationship with martial arts, with competition, and with himself. "The old Rico was performing strength," said Danny Reyes. "This Rico is building it. He's learning that real confidence doesn't need to prove itself constantly," added Sarah Chen, a jiu-jitsu practitioner who'd become part of Rico's training circle. "He's becoming someone you want to learn from instead of someone you want to see lose." As the morning training session ended, Rico found himself alone again with Elias, who was returning to his custodial duties. "Elias," Rico said, Would you consider teaching me more formally? I know I don't deserve it, but—" "Everyone deserves good teaching," Elias interrupted gently. "The question is whether they're ready to be good students." He studied Rico's face, seeing something there that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier. Genuine humility, authentic curiosity, the absence of ego that made real learning possible. "Tuesday and Thursday mornings," Elias said finally. "Before your regular training, and Rico—" "Yes, sir. Bring a notebook. The physical techniques are just the beginning. The real lessons are harder to remember." As Rico left the gym that morning, he passed a promotional poster for his upcoming title defense. The image showed the old Rico, cocky grin, theatrical, pose. Everything calculated for maximum intimidation factor. Looking at it now was like looking at a stranger. His phone buzzed again with what he knew were interview requests, sponsorship opportunities, demands for his attention and energy. But instead of checking them immediately, Rico simply put the phone away and walked into the Arizona morning, ready to discover what kind of champion he might become when he stopped trying to prove he already was one. The MGM Grand in Las Vegas buzzed with the familiar energy of a championship fight night, but something felt different about Rico Santoro's return to the spotlight. The usual promotional circus was notably muted. No trash talk sessions, no manufactured controversy, no viral social media campaigns designed to generate heat. Instead, Rico had insisted on a different kind of build-up. His interviews focused on technique, discipline, and respect for his opponent. His training footage showed methodical preparation rather than flashy highlights. Even his entrance music had changed from aggressive rap to something more contemplative. Miranda Cho sat ringside, her documentary cameras positioned to capture what she suspected would be the culmination of an extraordinary transformation. Over the past 2 months, she'd watched Rico evolve from a social media sensation obsessed with image into something rarer in professional sports, an authentic martial artist who happened to compete professionally. His opponent tonight was Miguel "Lightning" Rodriguez, a rising contender known for his flashy style and social media presence. Rodriguez represented everything Rico had been just months earlier: young, hungry, and eager to make his name by taking down an established champion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. In the dressing room, Rico prepared with the same quiet focus he'd developed during his morning training sessions. Gone were the entourage of yes-men and social media managers. Instead, his corner consisted of Danny Reyes, who'd become his primary boxing coach, and surprisingly, Elias Takoda. The elderly janitor-turned-teacher sat quietly in the corner, his presence serving as a reminder of the principles Rico had worked so hard to internalize. Elias had initially resisted Rico's request to work his corner, but something about the young man's genuine transformation had convinced him to step back into the spotlight he'd long avoided. "Remember," Elias said as Rico wrapped his hands, "you're not fighting Miguel Rodriguez tonight. You're demonstrating what you've learned. The victory is in the demonstration, not the decision." Rico nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. This fight wasn't about defending his title or maintaining his ranking. It was about showing that authentic martial arts could coexist with professional competition, that strength and humility weren't mutually exclusive. The arena erupted as the fighters made their entrances. Rodriguez came out with all the theatrical flair that Rico had once employed. Pyrotechnics, dramatic music, poses for the cameras. The crowd ate it up, chanting his name and waving signs declaring him the future of boxing. Rico's entrance was notably different. He walked to the ring with calm purpose, acknowledging the crowd but not playing to them. His team followed behind with quiet professionalism. In the third row, Steven Seagal sat with arms crossed, watching, with the same centered attention he'd brought to their sparring session months earlier. As the fighters touched gloves, Rodriguez tried to get into Rico's head with the kind of psychological warfare that had once been Rico's specialty. "You've gone soft, old man," he whispered. "All that meditation and respect bullshit won't help you when I'm breaking your face." Rico looked at him with something that might have been compassion. "Good luck tonight, Miguel. Fight well." The response clearly frustrated Rodriguez, who had expected the old Rico to rise to the bait. Instead, he found himself facing an opponent who seemed completely uninterested in mental games. The opening bell rang, and immediately the difference in Rico's approach became apparent. Where he once would have come out aggressively, looking to establish dominance early, now he moved with measured precision. His footwork showed the influence of his Aikido training, fluid, balanced, always positioning himself advantageously, without wasted motion. Rodriguez fighting in the style that had made him famous through explosive combinations designed to look spectacular. But Rico's defense was a masterclass in efficiency. He slipped punches by minimal margins, redirected power shots with subtle movements, and countered with precise economical strikes that accumulated damage without creating highlight reel moments. By the third round, the pattern was clear. Rodriguez was fighting for the cameras, for the crowd, for the viral moments that would boost his social media presence. Rico was fighting for the fight itself, responding to what his opponent gave, him adapting to the rhythm of the contest, demonstrating the principles he'd learned rather than trying to impose his will through force. "He's not the same fighter," the television commentator observed. "Santoro's always been powerful, but this is different. This is intelligent, mature." In the corner between rounds, Elias offered minimal advice. "You're doing exactly what you've trained to do. Trust the process." Rodriguez's corner, meanwhile, was increasingly frantic. Their fighter's signature style was being neutralized by an opponent who seemed to exist in a different paradigm entirely. Their instructions became more desperate, urging Rodriguez to take bigger risks, to force the action. The middle rounds saw Rodriguez growing increasingly frustrated. His flashy combinations were being systematically dismantled by Rico's composed responses. What was worse, Rico wasn't even trying to humiliate him. He was simply outclassing him with quiet competence, which somehow felt more devastating than any trash talk or showboating. As the fight progressed, something unexpected happened. The crowd, initially drawn to Rodriguez's explosive style, began to appreciate the subtle artistry of Rico's performance. They started to respond to his defensive mastery, his precise counters, his complete control of distance and timing. "This is what boxing looks like when ego gets out of the way," Miranda said into her documentary microphone. "This is martial arts as conversation rather than conquest." The final rounds were a clinic. Rico controlled every exchange without appearing to dominate, responded to every attack without seeming defensive. He was demonstrating the highest level of martial arts, making the difficult look effortless, the complex appear simple. When the final bell rang, there was no question about the outcome. Rico had won every round, but more importantly, he had shown that authentic martial arts principles could elevate professional competition rather than diminish it. As the judges announced the unanimous decision, Rico raised his hands briefly, then immediately sought out Rodriguez to embrace him. "You fought well," he said genuinely. "You made me better tonight." Rodriguez, frustrated and exhausted, initially resisted the gesture. But something in Rico's sincerity broke through his defensive anger. The embrace that followed was real, two fighters recognizing each other's effort and humanity. In the ring interview, Rico was asked about his transformation, about the difference in his fighting style, about what had changed since his last fight. "I learned that being a champion isn't about proving you're better than everyone else," he said, the arena still buzzing with energy. "It's about demonstrating the best of what martial arts can be. It's about showing that strength and respect can coexist, that you can be competitive without being cruel." The interviewer pressed for more details about his training, his mindset, his future plans. But Rico kept his answers focused on the principles rather than personal drama. "I had great teachers," he said simply, his eyes finding Elias in the crowd. "They taught me that the real victory is becoming the kind of person you respect, not just the kind of person others fear." As the post-fight ceremonies concluded, Rico found himself surrounded not by the usual chaos of celebration, but by a different kind of energy. Respectful appreciation, genuine curiosity about his transformation, and something that had been absent from his previous victories. Real admiration for the person he was becoming, rather than just the fighter he had been. The circle had indeed come around, but not in the way anyone had expected. 6 months later, the Ironforge Combat Club had taken on a different character entirely. The red velvet ropes were gone, replaced by simple benches where visitors could observe training sessions. The promotional banners had been replaced with calligraphy displaying martial arts principles in multiple languages. The atmosphere was quieter, more focused, more respectful. Rico Santoro arrived at 5:30 a.m. as he had every morning since his transformation began, but now he wasn't alone. A small group of serious martial artists had begun joining his pre-dawn sessions, not social media followers looking for content, but genuine students drawn to the authentic training environment he'd helped create. Elias Takoda still arrived earlier than everyone else, but his role had evolved beyond custodial work. Trevor Blackstone, recognizing the shift in the gym's reputation and clientele, had formally hired Elias as a master instructor. The same man, who had been publicly humiliated as just a janitor, now taught sold-out seminars on traditional martial arts principles. This morning, as Rico worked through his Aikido forms, he noticed a familiar stillness in the air. Steven Seagal had entered quietly, watching the training session with the same centered attention he brought to everything. "Teacher," Rico said, bowing respectfully as he approached. "Student," Steven replied, returning the bow. "I have something for you." He handed Rico a simple envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. There is one more lesson waiting, if you're ready to receive it. Come to the mountains when you can leave your title behind. SS. Rico looked up, questions in his eyes, but Steven was already walking toward where Elias was arranging training equipment. What does he mean? Rico asked Elias. The older man smiled mysteriously. That depends on what you think you still need to learn. Over the following weeks, Rico found himself thinking about Steven's invitation. His professional career was at its peak. The transformed champion was drawing new fans, new respect, new opportunities. But something in Steven's words suggested there were depths to martial arts he hadn't yet explored. Miranda Cho's documentary had been released to critical acclaim, winning awards for its portrayal of authentic transformation in professional sports. The film, titled The Lesson When Ego Meets Mastery, had sparked conversations about the role of traditional martial arts in modern competition, about the difference between performance and practice, about what it really meant to be strong. The success had brought new opportunities for Rico, movie offers, book deals, speaking engagements. But he found himself drawn back to the simple morning training sessions, to the honest work of continuing to learn and grow. Elias Takoda had started her own program at the gym, teaching young wrestlers the same principles her grandfather had passed down: discipline over flash, substance over style, respect over dominance. Her classes were small but intense, attracting serious young athletes who were tired of the toxic culture that pervaded much of competitive sports. You know, she told Rico one morning as they trained together, Grandpa said something interesting about you yesterday. What's that? He said you're the first student he's had who learned to be humble before learning to be powerful, instead of the other way around. Rico considered this. What's the difference? Most people become strong first, then have to unlearn their arrogance. You learned humility when you were already strong. That's much rarer. That afternoon, Rico made his decision. He called Steven and accepted the invitation to train in the mountains, away from gyms and cameras and the distractions of professional competition. The retreat lasted 2 weeks. High in the California mountains with no internet connection and no schedule beyond sunrise and sunset, Rico discovered aspects of martial arts he'd never imagined. Steven's teaching went beyond technique, beyond philosophy, into something that could only be called spiritual practice. They trained in silence for hours, movements flowing like meditation. They discussed the responsibility that came with real power, the obligations of those who possessed the ability to influence others. They explored the connection between martial arts and character, between technique and wisdom. When Rico returned to Phoenix, he was quieter than ever, but somehow more present. The change was subtle but profound, visible in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he related to others. Back at Ironforge, the morning training session had grown to include a dozen regular participants. The group was diverse, professional, fighters, weekend warriors, older adults seeking fitness and discipline, young people looking for authentic guidance in an increasingly artificial world. Rico led the session not as a champion instructing lesser fighters, but as a senior student, sharing what he'd learned. The distinction was crucial and visible to everyone present. The real work, he told a new student struggling with a basic technique, isn't in perfecting the movement. It's in perfecting the intention behind the movement. Elias watched from his position near the equipment rack, no longer cleaning but observing, always teaching through his presence. A small bronze plaque had been installed near the entrance to the main training area, in honor of Elias Takoda, master teacher, whose strength was always in his stillness. As the morning session ended, Rico found himself sweeping the mats, not because it was required, but because it felt right. The circular nature of the work, the meditative quality of the simple task, the service to the community of martial artists, it all connected to lessons that went deeper than fighting technique. Miranda approached with her ever-present camera, now documenting the ongoing story of the gym's transformation. Any regrets? She asked. About giving up the spotlight, the fame, the persona that made you famous? Rico paused in his sweeping, considering the question seriously. I didn't give up the spotlight, he said finally. I learned to use it differently. The attention, the platform, it's all still there. But now it serves something larger than just my ego. He gestured around the gym, where serious martial artists of all ages and backgrounds were training with focus and mutual respect. This is what I wanted to build all along. I just didn't know it until I learned what I was actually capable of. As the day's training concluded and the gym prepared to empty, Rico received a text message from Steven. The student is ready for the next lesson, but this one you'll have to discover on your own. The teacher is always there when you need him. Sometimes he's holding a mop, sometimes wearing gloves, sometimes just sitting quietly in the corner. Pay attention. Rico smiled, understanding that his real education was just beginning. Thus he, championship belt in his apartment, the accolades and awards, the social media following. These were all just tools now, means to a larger purpose he was still discovering. He looked around the gym one more time before leaving, seeing not just a training facility but a community built on principles that transcended competition. Elias was finishing his evening duties with the same methodical precision he'd always shown, but now everyone recognized it for what it was, a master practicing his art. The lesson continued as it always had, in the space between one breath and the next, in the gap between technique and application, in the silence that existed at the heart of all true strength. Rico walked into the Arizona evening, no longer the prime cut who had once demanded attention and respect, but something rarer and more valuable. A martial artist in the truest sense, someone who had learned that the highest mountain was the one inside himself and that climbing it was the work of a lifetime. The story ended where it began, with honest work, quiet dignity, and the recognition that real power served something greater than itself. The circle was complete, but the spiral continued upward, always. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.